or maybe the most beautiful campus you've ever seen? Raise your hand. Well, Frank Zwart is one of the people, is maybe the person, well, he's one of the people very responsible for that happening. Frank came to UCSC in 1967 as a freshman, and he majored in mathematics. Luckily for everybody, I like the quote. I like the quote that he talked to Jasper Rhodes, who was a proctor, whatever here, and Jasper said to him, "Do you think about mathematics every minute?" And he said, "No." He said, "Then don't go into being a mathematician. Think about architecture." And a couple of years later, Frank left California and went to Princeton and became an architect. And then he worked here and there and finally came to the university where he was first campus architect. And then at the very end, he was the vice president for physical planning and construction, something like that, right? Right. And I want to mention that Frank and his wife, Julia Armstrong Zwart, who's not here. She is here. Oh, there you are. Well, are one, both members of OLLI. Shows how smart they are. And Julia had important positions in the administration of this university. So we can be, I think Julia could give a good talk for us too, which would be interesting. So besides that, Frank was in the American Institute of Architects and all kinds of things. So here we go, okay? You ready?
Thank you, Lois. It's always nice to be back here and to ask you to jump into the Wayback Machine with me. It's going to be the same place, but a very different time. Let me try my little thing here and see if this works about advancing slides. Oh. All right, I'll have to do it from the machine. I'm going to go back a little further than Lois did to what brought me here originally. Let's see, we're not advancing. Oh, there we go. All right. Takes a while. This was my junior year high school picture. And a few years before that, you could see on the date in 1964, I grew up in Pasadena and I came to the breakfast table one morning, and my father, who was born in San Francisco and raised us to believe that we were Northern Californians in exile, said, "There's an article in the Times this morning about a new campus at the University of California is starting in Santa Cruz, and it sounds like just the place for you." So I read the article. I think this must have been it, thanks to the magic of the internet. And I think this is what caught my eye, the idea of combining the remarkable scholarly resources of a great university with the human dimensions of a small college. And then it goes on to talk about liberal arts and bridging the gap between curricular and co-curricular environment. So that's what brought me here and led to my being here today. To what I'm going to talk about, that one of the teachers I had in high school, Brother Raphael Patton, was a brilliant mathematician, and he taught us that when it comes to works of creativity or imagination, that it's about 10% inspiration or imagination and 90% perspiration. So I'm going to give you some of each this morning, some of the magic inspiration and some of the slog that it took to bring Santa Cruz here. I've also got in here, as I did research on the history of the campus, came across some surprises and some hidden jewels, which will be identified this way in the talk. Little known facts and events, or really nice surprises, some of which led to pointed to a future that we didn't follow. And that leads to alternative histories. And then at the end, if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about some contemporary institutions to remind you how unique Santa Cruz is, and then possibly talk about reactions of some famous people to the Cowell Ranch site. So when I was working on some architectural history shortly after I retired, I was at a campus event, and I was talking to a faculty member, I don't remember who, and I said I was working on this, and he said, well, wasn't there a bus ride? And central to the creation myth of Santa Cruz was, in fact, a bus ride that occurred in July of 1960, where a bunch of regents and officials from the Office of the President came from Berkeley, first to Santa Cruz, and then over the hill to Almaden to compare the two final sites for this new campus. And I'll be telling that story a little bit later. But you can see on that picture a rendering that became a formal invitation from the city and county to Santa Cruz to come here, showing a very different campus than we know today. It really looks like a classic 1950s or 1960s campus in Santa Cruz. So now we're in the Wayback Machine to the 1950s, and Santa Cruz was a very different place than it is now. It was really a slow growth area. The state was growing at a rate of 50% in a decade. Santa Cruz was projected to grow by only 10%. It had the highest percentage of people over 65 of any major city in the state. And as of 1950, the percentage of college graduates was lower than other urban areas in California, and there was nowhere in the county for a student to continue his or her education past high school. But things were changing in the late 1950s. There'd been a huge flood that wiped out downtown Santa Cruz in 1955, and there was a big redevelopment project, that gave us the complex where Trader Joe's and CVS is today downtown. There was an election to create a junior college district, and in a June of 1960 election, 75% of the voters approved it, which is really quite a remarkable number. And then the city and the county were both publishing the sorts of things that municipal and county governments do, I think for the first time, to look towards the future. And here's one of the first surprises that I came across. Many of us think that the Greenbelt in Santa Cruz was the result of an election in 1975, which it was, but it wasn't a new idea. In the early drafts of that general plan, it was mentioned 9 times. Green belts of open space, green belts for scenery, green belts for agriculture. Agriculture and green belt and forest land should be protected against urban development and a green belt designated. When the final document came out, though, there was only one mention of the green belt, and it'd be interesting to find out what happened. But if you take a look at the general plan, the Board of Supervisors adopted it in 1961, and it looked specifically at the north part of the campus, the north part of the county, and mentioned the economic stimulus that a new University of California campus would attend. By this time, the city and the county were active, as you'll hear, in trying to attract the regents to establish a new campus here. Now it's time for a little show and tell. My native San Francisco father was a real California chauvinist. And when we were cleaning out the house I grew up in, when my brother and I were cleaning up the house after both my parents had died, I came across these magazines from the 1960s devoted entirely to California and for Look and Life and Newsweek. So the state was full of the optimism that came about in the post-war area that led to baby boomers like me. The baby boom was well underway, and as of 1960, Kevin Starr pointed out that members of the baby boom generation, those born after 1946, would be only four years away from entering college. So it was incumbent on the state to start to get ready for that. But in the 40s, the state had actually put together, the State Board of Education oversaw the state colleges and universities and the community college system. The regents were constitutionally independent of that, but they put together a coordinating committee that in the 1950s did studies to look towards that sort of future. And the study recommended a study of the need for additional centers recommended 4 locations that became ultimately the San Diego, the Irvine, the Santa Cruz campuses. The 4th one was in the Central Valley, but that took several decades before UC Merced was established. But the idea was to distribute them geographically. Now, to see the reputation of California in the eyes of the country, this is an excerpt from Newsweek in 1962. The Bay Area set around the jewel of San Francisco with research labs and electronic plants, luxuriant suburbs, and universities, mentioning Cal and Stanford. Its ferment of saxophones, cyclotrons, and egghead beatnik intellectuality. We're proud of that still, I think. And the older fermentings of Santa Clara and Napa Valley vineyards. Some things just never seem to change. Some 42% of the state budget goes to the public school system, including the biggest and possibly the best state college system in the States, but more was going to be needed in the future. They expected enrollment at the University of California to expand from 57,000 to 96,000. All of the 8 campuses, some of which hadn't been created yet, will have to be expanded. The swelling tax burden, which much spending applies, may invoke a law of diminishing returns in still another form. By driving away industry or discouraging new businesses from moving in, it could reduce the jobs which are as essential to California as water or school systems. Candidate Richard Nixon, candidate for governor, already sees signs of tax resistance among California businessmen. Incumbent Pat Brown sees no such thing. The Democrats lean to master plans made in Sacramento with local acceptance or rejection, and state officials even now are in a veritable paroxysm of surveys, studies, or master planning. And it's some of that we're going to be looking at today. Now, if you open up the Look magazine, this was another surprise that I came across. You'll notice some of you probably knew Page Smith, the founding provost of Cowell College and an American historian himself. And here's how they described him and the campus. Barefoot boys and girls carry books along pathways flecked with sun and shadow. 2,000 acres, another California dream coming true. Eventually, it will have 27,500 students. Will it ever be big or impersonal? It cannot, for it will consist of 20 or more little liberal arts colleges, each directed by a provost who will live on his campus. Well, we only made it to 10, but the college system is still what drives the campus. So in 1957, in October, at the Regents meeting in October that year, the Regents appointed Clark Kerr, who was a professor of industrial relations at Berkeley, as chancellor of the entire system, and he would be key in establishing Santa Cruz. But just as importantly, at that same meeting, they approved the start of a site selection process for 3 new campuses, the ones that became San Diego, Irvine, and Santa Cruz. Not coincidentally, I think, that was 2 weeks after the former Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, setting off the space race and a real focus on higher education throughout the country. And certainly the growth of the University of California was a big part of that. The city and county of Santa Cruz didn't waste any time, because just within a few weeks of that decision, they had invited officials from the University of California system-wide office down to look at 4 possible sites in Santa Cruz County for a new campus. 3 of them were in South County, and the 4th one was where we wound up at the Cowell Ranch in Santa Cruz. You'll see over and over again, or I'll mention over and over again, Gordon Sinclair, who was very active in this. He was the editor of the Santa Cruz Sentinel at the time, and really had spearheaded a lot of this activity trying to get the Regents here. He was a fascinating character. He had been adopted as an infant, but his family couldn't afford college. So after he graduated from high school, he went to work for the Sentinel, never got a college education, but rose to the position of editor of the Sentinel, and then was a loud proponent statewide for higher education ever since. And they put together, the city and county created a committee to invite the university here, and they put together a document spelling out the advantages of this site to the Regents. And it's interesting, we'll see several times here how Santa Cruz saw itself or presented itself in those days. Looking at Santa Cruz as a university community, it's known as the county of contrast, and Santa Cruz is the hub of the county. The city has stabilized its traditional resort trade and agricultural products by establishing light industrial plants. Think Wrigley's, think Lipton Tea. It is one of the lowest crime rates in the state. It is a clean city, clean air and clean citizens. We'll see this again. A city of churches of all denominations and a city without racial prejudices. And you can see it talked about all of the available housing. So housing for all of these students simply wouldn't be a problem. There's all those summer places that we can fill up with students when you put a new campus here. I like the last one particularly because it talks about we're connected to every state because of the great highway system that Caltrans is putting together, and it's not quite as robust as that. But shortly after that meeting, Gordon Sinclair wrote a series of thank you notes to people who participated. And Hal Hyde, who was from the family that owned Ford's department store in Watsonville, he was a Watsonville native, was very active in that. Hal was a Cowell alumnus, and the local alumni association also played a big role in attracting the Regents to Santa Cruz. At the same time, the Regents were putting together a set of criteria that they would use to pick a new campus. And I want to point out to you two names. Bob Evans was the university architect, a staff member, worked system-wide, a wonderful man. And he was very involved, as you'll see in a few minutes, in creating the Santa Cruz campus. And this committee was chaired by Professor Wheelock, who was a oceanography professor at what was then Scripps Institution and became San Diego. But Wheelock was a retired Rear Admiral who'd been very active in designing ship propulsion systems. After he left the Navy, he joined the faculty at Scripps. And when he retired from there, he and his wife moved to Pebble Beach, and he actually served on the campus planning committee during the early days. And it's an interesting connection. I'm not going to talk about a man named Elmo Morgan. Elmo Morgan was Bob Evans' boss in the University of California, but he oversaw the development of all new campuses. And one of his earlier jobs was to build the nuclear test site at Los Alamos, New Mexico. So I think there's a story to be told about the influence of military planning on the development of the University of California. But if we look at some of the criteria that were used, it talked about an enrollment of 25,000. That was essentially based on what Berkeley and UCLA were at the time. It suggested that it be close to where the population is, the areas that were going to be served. And this was a real surprise to me. One of the explicit criteria for the new campuses was aesthetics. California is a state of marvelous natural beauty, and that should be reflected in its institutions as well as in its environment. It also laid out again, as another evaluative criteria, the potential to develop a joint university city or university community, centered community. And what was interesting is that they actually saw this as a recruiting tool. The key to high quality performance is a distinguished faculty and a select student body, so that in choosing a site, every advantage should be taken to attract those kinds of people to the new campuses. Gordon Sinclair was busy back in Santa Cruz, first of all, asking for letters of support from various community organizations. He asked that they all be sent to him and that they would use them strategically as this search for a campus in Santa Cruz came. So I'm just going to run through what some of those groups were. The National Association of Retired Civil Employees, the Chaparral Poets Society. I'm pleased to tell you that that still exists. Sadly, though, the Santa Cruz enrollment dropped below 5 people. So there's no longer a chapter in Santa Cruz, but if 5 people want to start one up, I think you can find the Chaparral Poets on the website. the Historical Society, the Animal Welfare Association, the Naval Reserve Training Center, the Junior League of the YWCA, and the YWCA itself. And again, the kind of description that citizens were making of the city. Again, it's a clean, wonderful location, perfect for a university, a city of many sub-churches and a substantial middle-class homes. The Women's Club. The First Congregational Church was something of a surprise because it turns out that their then pastor was one of the founding members of the University of California back in the 19th century. And this was a hidden jewel. This was in the university's archives. Its author is not identified, but from the context, I'm pretty sure that it was a letter from Hal Hyde to Larry Livingston, a planner who we'll meet in a minute, who was working on it. Hal had known Larry when they were both at Berkeley together. And it describes Santa Cruz, a producing area. Agricultural products and processed foods go throughout the world from here. Direct teletype land through land and air. So we're a part of the broader international trade network. What manner of people do this? I love this description of 1950s, 1960s diversity. Practically every country in the world is represented. We have no prejudice problems. Our Phi Beta Kappa judge, son of immigrant Slavs, our bank president and Bankers Association president, last term, the son of immigrant Danes. Our Iranian implement dealership manager, current president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, who traveled on behalf of the State Department, a Pulitzer Prize winning editor in Watsonville, a labor arbitrator, a music association, so there's lots of culture in Santa Cruz as well, a painters group, a Baroque music society, many good people who would support a university. Sinclair also wrote personal letters to many state officials, as you see there. And he actually put together a lunch. Samuel Least was the son of the Least department store family who had gone on to become the first city administrative officer in Los Angeles. He had connections with regents. So a group of Santa Cruz citizens met with the chairman of the board of Bank of America, the publisher of the Examiner, the managing editor and the publisher, and the vice president of Pacific Telephone and Telegraph at the Pacific Union Club in San Francisco, again, to lobby them for support. And they put together the document that you saw earlier, an invitation. Full of photographs with local photographer Ed Weber. You can see aerial photographs, a picture of one of the kilns at the entrance to the campus, the perfect campus site, it says. Aerial photographs of what later became the Santa Cruz campus. And in conclusion, let's see if I can read this. Urban development, flood control, yacht harbor, off-street parking, et cetera, where everything's up to date in Kansas City, Santa Cruz. A clean, livable city, free from crime and congestion, no rivers of smog to irritate the eyes, nor valleys of vice to destroy the temperance of conduct. A tranquil yet progressive surroundings. Did we lose? Oh gosh, aha. There we go. The type of community attractive to faculty and students alike. Clearly, as they put this together, they were paying very close attention to the criteria that the university had established for a new campus. And it talks about, because of all of the rental housing, we weren't going to have a problem with housing our students. The Office of the President then hired planners Larry Livingston and architect John Carl Warnicki to do a study about where the campus ought to be located. They considered 74 sites, took a preliminary look at 15 of those sites, and then narrowed down to detailed studies of 4 sites, 3 around San Jose and here the Cowell Ranch in Santa Cruz. And then the final report to the Regents Special Committee for picking sites, they said that if you wanted a campus with a community to grow in concert with the university, the Cowell Ranch would do it. But if you want to attract a large enrollment in a short period of time, then a Santa Clara Valley site should be selected. In December of '59, the Special Committee of the Regents recommended further study of the Almaden site. And then what Hal Hyde called the unselling of Almaden started. They sent more letters to regents and state officials. They started a nationwide publicity campaign. And then there was the bus trip. So the story that the bus trip goes is that the regents and Bob Evans and other officials from the Office of the President boarded a bus on a July day and came down first to Santa Cruz. And it was an absolutely beautiful July morning. The committee had rehearsed everything. Everything was perfect. They drove up into the center of the site. It was a glorious summer day. They saw the view of the bay. They saw a lovely, lovely setting. They were hosted royally, generously. They got back in the bus, drove over the hill to a smoggy day in Almaden. Their bus was too big to navigate the roads on the Almaden site. So they had to break down into smaller, non-air conditioned buses, and sort of and one of the newspaper articles describing this, or maybe Dean McHenry's oral history, quoted one of the regents, Buffy Chandler, why it had cost us a fortune to air condition a campus there. So Santa Cruz worked at downplaying the problems of distance from San Francisco and populated areas, and more on the spectacular beauty and the potential and willingness of the community to welcome the university here. In July of 1960, that worked. The regents decided to give Santa Cruz another look and authorized further study of the Cowell Ranch site. At the September meeting, they agreed to spend some more money on additional studies of the Santa Cruz site. And then in October, President Clark Kerr appointed 3 faculty members from Berkeley: Clarence Brown in psychology, Stephen Pepper from philosophy, and William Worster, an architect, distinguished architect with a national reputation and the founding dean of the College of Environmental Design at Berkeley, to visit the 2 sites. And their decision was unanimous. They unanimously recommended Santa Cruz over Almaden. They talked first of all about the natural beauty of the site, describing it as spectacular. They also talked about the cost. The Almaden site was going to cost nearly 3 times as much as Santa Cruz. Although this talks about lots of property owners in both Santa Cruz and Almaden, when it actually came down to it, the regents only had to deal with the Cowell Foundation, so there was only one property owner. Dean McHenry, in his oral history, talks about some touchiness on the Almaden site because some of the land was owned by the Jesuit order, and Governor Pat Brown's son Jerry was in the seminary with the Jesuits at that time, so that was something that was on the mind of the founding faculty member. It also mentions that the Cowell Foundation had offered to sell the land to the regents at a reasonable price and use that money to endow a building on campus, and that building became Cowell College. That's exactly what happened. And so again, unanimously, they recommended the Cowell Ranch site for cost and for both for cost and for beauty of the site. The additional funding that the regents funded for the city, the community group put together, hired a very distinguished architectural and planning team from Berkeley. Lawrence Lackey is the urban design consultant, Campbell and Wong, who went on to design Merrill College, and landscape architects Royston Hanamoto and Mays, to do a study which came up with a very different campus than the one that we know, mainly in the meadows, with the sorts of things that campuses of the 1950s and the early 1960s had. Of course, there was an administration building, a student union, and a library, but things that are very foreign to us today. High Street was to be lined with fraternities, sororities, and high-density residential serving the campus. There was also room for a school of home economics and physical education and military science, how things have changed. But in the site plan, they actually showed a divided site, and in the upper left, you can see the UC Santa Cruz Golf Course, along with some varsity athletic areas as well. But they also proposed joint planning between the city and the county and the university. So it took 3 months to come to a final decision. In December of 1960, the regents unanimously authorized negotiations with the Cowell Foundation. That followed, and the Cowell Foundation offered the 2,000 acres that became the campus. And in the March Regents meeting in Berkeley, the Regents voted 16-2 to come here. The two people who didn't vote against, who voted against it, Governor Brown and Lieutenant Governor Glenn Anderson, I always thought that that was their vote because there were more votes in Almaden than there were in Santa Cruz. San Jose Mercury gave a big headline. Here's the Sentinel, Santa Cruz prepares for UC campus, and quoted lots of excited Santa Cruzans about the choice. I feel this is the most significant thing that happened to Santa Cruz County in the last century, how important it was going to be to what they saw as the development of their community. And then for the people who were involved in this, I mentioned Bob Evans earlier. This was a photograph I took of him about a month after his 98th birthday. He was a wonderful, wonderful guy, and he oversaw all of this. He was very involved in the appointment of Jack Wagstaff, who I am always proud to say was the first employee at the UC Santa Cruz campus, not the chancellor, the campus architect. And what Bob Evans told me was that Jack Wagstaff had been at UC San Francisco. They'd had a very difficult project there, and Jack did a wonderful job on it. He said, we didn't know, Bob Evans said, we didn't know who the chancellor at Santa Cruz was going to be, but the campus architect and the chancellor had to get along. And he said, I figured if he could get along with those doctors, he could get along with anybody. So that's what sent Jack Wagstaff here. And then Dean McHenry was appointed the first chancellor. Dean McHenry and Clark Kerr, the president of the university, had known each other in graduate school, always argued back and forth of the advantages between a small liberal arts college, that was Kerr's perspective, or a large university. That was McHenry's perspective, having been a student at UCLA. And so the solution became a college, a university consisting of residential colleges, so it would seem small while growing large.
You're not sharing the screen.
Oh, what happened?
It's okay. It's okay.
What are you looking for?
Go there.
What's that? Where's the? That do it?
Folks, the delay is simply that the Zoomers are not seeing the screen, and we're trying to restore that.
And we appreciate it.
I would like to double that. Yes, we appreciate it.
Yay.
Me too, yay.
Working remotely now? Yeah, okay. Thank you. And now my computer has to wake up and start changing slides. Huh. Is that it? Okay, that's it. All right. So I was talking about the residential college system. One of the really quite interesting and lovely things I came across was a memo that Bob Evans wrote in anticipation of a meeting with Clark Kerr. And he talked about what the new campus ought to do. He said what the university should be, using Santa Cruz as an example. It appears that the pressure for mass education and restriction on funds are going to need new concepts and techniques of education. Techniques born of modern developments as teaching machines, automation, data processing equipment, and television. I believe we should develop a new campus that will take advantage of all the mechanisms possible. An arts and sciences college for lower division and upper division with supporting residence hall with single rooms equipped with ETV, educational television, and teaching machines. Well, it only took the internet to bring the ETV into student rooms. But I love this too. The library, the central library no longer be part of the campus, that it be connected by pneumatic tubes to libraries throughout the system. So again, we've got that with the internet. And another surprise, that's a rendering of what's now the communications, fine arts and communications building. And there was a real vision of technology as a means of decentralizing education. This is a photograph I took in about 1968 or 69 of Page Smith, an American historian, giving a lecture to a television camera, intending it for it to be seen remotely. So even then they were thinking of that. And I found drawings by Roy Rydell, a local landscape architect, to put an outdoor viewing platform and stage in front of the Humanities building for television broadcasts. That obviously never came about. And one of the academic planners from the campus in 1971 talked about that issue, that there are plenty of instructional media opportunities at Santa Cruz and not very well used, because there's an overwhelming concern for humanizing the undergraduate's education and a fear that technology will undermine the goal. So the Regents interviewed architects in September of 1961 and picked a team headed by John Carl Warnicki and local Bay Area architects Theodore Bernardi, Robert Anshin, Stephen Allen, Ernest Kump, and Thomas Church. Church was a landscape architect, and we'll talk about him in a minute. They made their first visit to the Cowell Ranch to start work, and that's in the same paper of that reporting of that visit. They show the classic picture of Dean McHenry at a desk over an open meadow. But Church himself, as the work went on, talked about the importance of collaborating with the environment, that the environment really ought to dictate to the designer the shape that the buildings would take. Gentle be the hand, it lays upon the land, is one of his classic quotes. And based on that, as they started work, one of the first things they did was to do a detailed analysis of the land of the Cowell Ranch. And they did a briefing in June of '62 to the president and to Regent McLaughlin. And then they came to Santa Cruz to see this. And the most important part of that meeting was the decision to move the campus from the base where it had been shown in that earlier scheme into the center of the campus, arguing that that was going to make more sense. You could expand both to the north and to the south. You wouldn't have to spend a lot of money on landscaping, lots of things. The Regents were photographed in cars from the local Buick dealership driving down through the Great Meadow. And at the end of the article, one of the regents was quoted as saying he was disappointed that they were riding in the Buicks provided by the same agency that provided them to the Miss California pageant, but Miss California wasn't there. The final LRDP was then prepared during 1963 and came with a core of buildings, the academic core we call it, that serve all of the colleges surrounded by residential colleges. And here are a few surprises. This is the center of the campus done in a drawing this big that we found in the archives as we were doing an exhibition on the early part of the campus. And I want to call attention to two things. Right about where the Student Center and Arts Complex is today was to be the administration building, viewed across the lower quarry. And then up very close to the east end of Natural Sciences Unit 2. When I was still working, somebody came into my office with 4 drawings about this tall, color, pastel. And right about, let's see, at the very top, you'll see a little scribble, and it said Mark Roque. I had worked for an architect in Carmel who'd worked on the LRDP, and he'd mentioned that Warnke had a French architect working with him on that. And I called Olaf, the Carmel architect, and I said, was his name Mark Roque? And he said, yes, it was. So this came out of the first LRDP effort. And it turns out that that called for a great vertical architectural symbol to give meaning to the campus, to give orientation. But Tommy Church didn't like it, and he yanked the dowel that represented it on a model of the campus. And so that was never built, which I think we're all better off for. The regents met to consider the LRDP in January, and the real surprise was that the cover page of the very formal bureaucratic documentation was a letter from Frederick Law Olmsted, best known for the design of Central Park, but early in his career, he'd actually surveyed Yosemite and had written a report about that then got buried for many years and wasn't discovered until the 20th century, where he talked about how important it was to preserve the landscape, this very special, very beautiful landscape. So the regents came to the meeting, they came and visited the campus. At the meeting, they actually toured the various parts of the campus. The minutes record that they took a look at all of the various natural settings. And then they met, that's in the hall of the Congregational Church, which is still there and in use today. They forwarded to approval to the full board, which is how it happens. And the next day it was approved by the full board of regents. Preserve beauty of sight, the regents tell the architect, which I always like to see and remind the regents whenever we talk to them about it. And it talks about what a wonderful and beautiful campus this was going to be. Now, one of the surprises, lots of people think that Santa Cruz was developed in response to the protest, the free speech movement at Berkeley. But if you look at the dates, this is December 1964. The LRDP had been approved more than a year before, 15 months before that. So it was not in response, but it was in Dean McHenry's mind, because shortly after the free speech movement hit the newspapers, he was quoted in an article in the Los Angeles Times as saying, well, now we know that this is important. He used it as a way of funding what was thought to be a more expensive campus, and he was successful at doing that. The other surprise was that as the regents in the university were developing a master plan, an environs plan for the area of around the campus was being developed by the city and the county. The planners who did it were the same planners who were working on the general plan for the city of Santa Cruz at the time. And it showed a very different Santa Cruz than we know. It was intended to design a residential community around the campus with preservation of natural beauty as the driving element. Of course, that's what you'd expect. But it proposed a population of 65,000 people on 4,000 acres. The campus, for comparison's sake, is about 2,000 acres. 17 neighborhoods, each with a 12-acre elementary school site, 6 junior high school and 3 high school sites, medium to high density housing along Bay and High Streets, and a commercial community shopping center intended consciously not to compete with downtown, but to supplement downtown on the area that we think of as Cave Gulch off of Empire Grade. And it included in the appendix a set of proposed development standards. The Regents approved the plan in principle in May of 1964. Later that year, the city council scheduled a meeting for the joint effort, and there was some give back to the university about, can you adjust some things? And I never found any indication of final approval. So I don't know what became of that document. And then in September of 1965, the first students arrived. But everything changed. The 1960s and the Vietnam War came along. You may recognize faces in some of these photographs. The Regents actually put into place something that was in place until 2018, regental policy on community planning. They actually hired within the office of the president a couple of planners. They divided up the 8 campuses among them to coordinate campus planning efforts with local planning efforts. Santa Cruz was really the first of those, and that movement may have been based on what was happening here in Santa Cruz. But it was eliminated in 1968 due to budget cuts. And I think that is one of the things that was very frustrating working for the university for so many years, is that the dealings with the local community were entirely the responsibility of the chancellor and the local campus. And there really wasn't much support from the office of the president when it came to those issues. And then, of course, as we know, there were things in the broader societal scale that were going along that affected the development of campus. CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which required environmental impact reports, went into force in 1970. Postal Commission was created in 1972. And then I mentioned earlier the Santa Cruz Greenbelt, created in 1979. So the 63 LRDP predicted that the influences would be in 2 directions. The university, through its students, staff, and program of activities, will impact the communities. And at the same time, the character of Santa Cruz will continuously affect the growth and life of the University of Campus. I think they were enormously prescient in saying that, although I don't think any of them could have predicted that thing. And you can see on the right-hand side, the current campus overlaid over that first 1963 long-range development plan. So I will put up here just various places where you can get information about this. I did an article with much of this information in a brochure, well, more than a brochure, a booklet or a journal that the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History published a few years ago that's still available, about planning in Santa Cruz. And Uncommon Places available on the line. That's an exhibition I put together with retired faculty Virginia Jansen, Michael Cowan, and Jim Clifford. We put it on at the university's 50th anniversary year in 2015, and that's available digitally on the library's website. Bill Doyle, a retired, he was one of the founding faculty members in biology. He wrote a book on the origin of UC Santa Cruz. That's available as a book, excuse me, as a print to order book. And it was very useful in putting these notes together. And then the special collections and the Regional History Project at McHenry Library have been invaluable. So with that, I don't think we have time for my additional stuff, so I'm happy to open the floor for questions. I saw a hand go up right there.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Very, very interesting. Yeah, we've got time for questions. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I really didn't know any of that stuff. However, I live on High Street. Why didn't they make any provision for getting to the university?
Well,
I cannot get out of my. For certain hours of the day, I simply cannot get out of the driveway. It is solid line of traffic up and down High Street. Why did they make no provision for how to get in and out of the campus?
they did actually, but it never got built. There were two things. There was to be an extension of Highway 17 to Highway 1 as a freeway through town. And I remember as a student going down to the Civic Auditorium to protest that, saying, don't make Santa Cruz Los Angeles. And second, the county actually, in the original agreement with the campus, committed to building what's called an Eastern Access Road through what's now the Poganip to bring cars up and avoid all of High Street. I mean, we live on Spring Street, and every time we drive up and down High Street at one of those times, we think, my gosh, we're glad we don't live here. But I do remember the last time, let's see, I retired in 2010, and the last long-range development plan that was in effect while I was still working was published in 2005. And I remember a very brief conversation with one of our planners, and I wish I'd pursued it a little bit more. They said that they did some traffic studies that looked about what the impact of the Eastern Access Road would be on traffic, and it wouldn't make that much difference in the traffic on High Street. So the idea was, I mean, as you saw in that, when there were going to be all of those residences around the campus, they were going to build a road system to do that, and that never came to pass.
This was a wonderful talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
When was it discovered that large portions of the campus had hollow karst formation areas that couldn't be built on, and how has that influenced the development of the campus?
Let me tell you, I'll tell you a personal anecdote, and then I'll answer your question. Before I became campus architect, I was the project architect for what's now called the Science and Engineering Library. And it was in an area of campus where we had known that there were karst voids. And so we did extensive geotechnical investigation. And the geotechnical engineer was a Stevenson College alumnus who I'd done a lot of work with. So I was eager to find out what they'd found out. And I called him and I said, so Steve, have you got any results yet from the borings at the science library site? And he says, oh yeah. He said, I've got the logs right here on my desk. I said, so what's the news? He said, Frank, we have an opportunity for excellence. And I thought, oh God, we're in for it now. But Steve, the soils engineer, was a remarkable, he got people, his firm's motto was dirt is our life. And he actually got a room full of librarians, architects and engineers, and funding people from the Office of the President, fascinated by what they found at the site. The Office of the President sent us $80,000 to do more investigation, and we wound up finding out that it wasn't quite so bad. But it was known a long time ago. I found, as I was going through the archives, a map showing areas of known karst that was dated back in the 1960s. So it was known. I think it was just felt that it could be managed with smart geotechnical engineering, and we've actually managed to do that. And I do remember a conversation with that geotechnical engineer. He says, you know, occasionally we will, I know even before I worked on the science library, I worked on the project that included the swimming pool, the Olympic-sized swimming pool at the East Fieldhouse. And that was a project where we actually did move things around in response to what we found from the borings. But there was a circumstance where one boring 2 feet away from another boring came up with entirely different results. So it's a really very site-specific challenge that we face. So I think it was known for quite a while, but I think with the confidence of engineers, they figured they could solve it all, and they've actually managed to.
Any other question? Any other question? Does my mic work? Yes, here we go.
Some people write that Warnicki's library and Charles Moore's design for Kresge College were important turning points for the architecture of the campus. Are there other turning points that you especially call our attention to? Well,
I'm sort of, asking a campus architect which is his favorite building is like asking a parent which is your favorite child. You can't get a straight answer. I do think, and Kresge is very much on my mind because of the big renovation that's going on there now. But I remember hearing, I first came to Santa Cruz to work for an architect named Richard Peterson, who had been the campus planner in the late 60s and early 70s. And Richard told me that Charles Moore and Bill Turnbull were selected for that job based on what they had done at Sea Ranch, the site's sensitivity. And I think Kresge was a wonderful piece of imagination. I mean, it just, and it worked that way. So it was, and in fact, that's the one building on the Santa Cruz campus that is best known around the world internationally. Warnicki's library I haven't heard referred to in those regard, but my regard for it over the years has really grown. I could never figure out, for example, when I was a student, I'd sit inside the library and look out at a window, and right in front of the window would be a concrete column. And I thought to myself, why the hell did they put the column right in front of the window? But if you look at the shape of the columns there and the way they're carved into smaller pieces. They're indents in the middle of the column. So you get a real strong sense of verticality, and they really become concrete simulacrum of the forest beyond. So I think it really was a wonderful thing. But there are lots of places I'm really fond of as a Cal alumnus. I think Worcester Bernardi and Emmons and Lawrence Halpern did a marvelous job there citing it. One of the stories I heard was that one of the conditions of the Cowell gift to the campus was that the building that it was to fund be put on a site that could see the city and that could be seen from the city. And so I think Cowell, when it came to sites, really had the pick of the litter. I think the real accomplishment is really what Church set out to do, which was to get architects that could build sensitively rather than dominantly in the environment. But I've got favor. The Science Library, I think, is a real glorious building. Humanities building, I think, is a glorious building. Those are buildings I was involved in, so I'm saying that with some pride.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Terry Burke. I was founding faculty at Merrill College in 1968. And so one of the things over the years, because I walked around and hiked everywhere, both above and below ground, and got a sense of the campus as being this series of different islands, which if you took away the bridges, you couldn't understand how anybody could even think that there would be any development there, because you have these long, slender sort of islands with sometimes constructed bridges, sometimes walking bridges, et cetera. And it's just quite, I say, if you walk below those bridges, you'll get a very different sense of what the campus is like. So I don't know what that sparks for you, but I just thought I'd make.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I often say that it was a fit of madness to put a university campus on this site because of things like that, because of the soils that you mentioned before, but I'm so happy that somebody did. No, I think that's true. I also remember back in the 2005 long-range development plan, we worked with really good consulting architects from New York, of all places. And one of the things that they pointed out was it's not just the terrain and the bridges and so on. It's as you walk through the campus, there are areas of shadow and areas of bright sunshine. And so there are lots of different overlapping kinds of islands within the campus. And I do think one of the challenges we always faced is that it's really hard to get funding for those sorts of infrastructures. I always thought, for example, that the circulation on the campus would improve tremendously if we were to be able to build a couple of pedestrian bridges from the East Field House to the southern end of the parking lot by Han Student Services, and then a second bridge from there across to the center of the campus where the arts area and the student center is. Because then the east-west traverse on foot would have been just remarkable, but the funding never became available. So I think there's still opportunities for that kind of improvement, but whether that'll ever happen, I just don't know.
Thank you. I'm afraid our time is up, but I really appreciate your talk. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Folks, most of you know me. I'm Mark Gordon, and my job is to try to make sure that this facility stays